Well, I'm happy to be here with you this morning. My name is Delena. If you have not met me yet, I think I've met most of you in the room, but also welcome to those of you who are watching online. We'd love to have you join us. You know, I don't really know how long this has been going on, but we've been working through the Old Testament for a very long time, and we're going to continue to do so today. So we have made it to 1 Kings, okay, in the Old Testament. And let's go over some of the main highlights that we've covered over the last couple of weeks. So we've talked about King David, and he was a complicated king. He struggled, he sinned, he did good things too, but ultimately he always turned back to God. And regardless of his successes and his failures, David became known as a man after God's own heart. And then David has died. He has passed on the kingdom of Israel to his son Solomon. And with this, he passes on a promise from God that if your descendants watch their step and live faithfully in my presence with all their heart and being, then God promised, you will not fail to have a successor on the throne of Israel. And then we heard about how Solomon took on the mantle of king. And God allowed Solomon to ask for something from him. And Solomon requests the wisdom to rule Israel. We hear the Lord was pleased that Solomon made that request. And God said to him, because you asked for the ability to make wise judicial decisions, and not for long life, not for riches, not for vengeance on your enemies, I will grant your request and give you a wise and discerning mind superior to that of anyone who has preceded or will ever follow you. And God goes on and he's like, furthermore, I will give you what you did not request, riches and honor, so that you will be the greatest king of your generation. If you follow my instructions by obeying my rules and regulations, just as your father David did, then I will also grant you long life. And you know, we talked about how God is not a genie to give us whatever we ask of him, but he wants us to want the things that he has for us. And in this very particular case of Solomon, God chose to bestow the wisdom that Solomon asked for, along with more than he could have probably ever imagined. And you know, this ended a season of war and conquest, and we're ushered into the season of peace and building. Last week, we heard about Solomon spending years building the temple and his palace. You know, we even built some scale outlines with those blocks that were kind of hard to put together. If you didn't do it just right, they did not go together, right? And, you know, we're able to see some of the foreshadowing of some things that some things might be a little bit off when we started observing the size ratio difference between the temple that he built for God and the palace that he built for himself. And this is where we land to talk about the next events in Solomon's life today and what we're going to do and not going to do when things are going well. Together, the time of David and Solomon's kingship, it's commonly referred to as the United Monarchy. This is a period from around about 1000 BC to 931 BC, and it is a time in which Israel became the dominant nation in the ancient Near East. David had led successful military campaigns that extended his control over neighboring and distant lands. And then we're going to see that Solomon's administration, it capitalized upon Israel's strength and brought in vast wealth and cultural resources. Israel becomes this mini empire that eventually conforms to the conventional Near East model like the other countries. It was complete with political alliances, influences from many countries, militarily fortified administration, and centers that included palaces and military garrisons and the like. So with all of this happening, let's talk about someone who heard about Israel. They heard about Israel and what they were doing. They heard about Solomon. They heard about his God, and they had to come check it out to see what it was, to see if the rumors were true. They heard about it. Let's introduce the Queen of Sheba. You know, the location of Sheba is debated. I couldn't get any clear answers in my research. We have some ideas. There are a couple ideas of where people think Sheba was. This could be modern-day Yemen. It could be around Ethiopia, or it could have been as far as India, okay? And regardless of which regions she was a ruler of, it is made clear that what was happening in Israel was being talked about far away from where Israel was located, okay? The Queen of Sheba gave up months of time to travel from her nation, visit Solomon, and travel back. She's a ruler, and she gave up months away from her nation to do so. Could you imagine the type of stories you would have to hear to just up and walk away from your household and job and other life responsibilities just to go find out what's going on? Like, it's not like she didn't have an important job. She was a ruler. Like, she's got a country to take care of, okay? Like, what type of stories would be happening that this would be your response? Now, and it's not exactly, we don't have a modern day equivalent to this, okay? We have airplanes, we have cars, like we have faster travel than what they had. She traveled by camel caravan. And regardless of whether she came from India or the Arabian Peninsula or the coast of Africa, she traveled over 1,000 miles plus by camel caravan to visit Israel without even knowing whether her audience would be accepted by the king, but she decided to come anyways. The camels carried spices, large quantities of gold, and precious stones, and she just came to have a conversation with Solomon. She asked all of her difficult questions, and it turns out there was nothing too difficult that Solomon couldn't answer. And I would love to know what she came to talk to him about. Was it philosophy? Maybe she had questions about governing a country? Did she gather all the hardest questions that everyone in her country had? I have no idea. I have no idea what she asked. We can only speculate to the nature of the questions that she came to test Solomon's wisdom with. However, we do get to see her response to Solomon. When she was able to experience Solomon's wisdom, the palace that he built, his food, his officials, the servants, the offerings he made to God at the temple, she was overwhelmed by it all. It was so much, more than she could have ever imagined. We hear what she says in 1 Kings 10, 6-9. The report I heard in my own country about your wise sayings and insights was true. I did not believe these things until I came and saw them with my own eyes. Indeed, I didn't even hear half the story. Your wisdom and wealth surpass what was reported to me. Your attendants who stand before you at all times and hear your wise sayings are truly happy. May the Lord your God be praised because he favored you by placing you on the throne of Israel. Because of the Lord's eternal love for Israel, he made you king so that you could make just and right decisions. In previous weeks, we had talked about how God had chosen Israel to be the nation to represent him on earth during this time to all of the other nations. Kind of like that game tag, Israel was it, and was to spread the knowledge of the one true God to the nations around them. And here, we actually see an example that this was happening. Good things are happening in Israel with Solomon, and with the God of Israel. He is being talked about in nations far, far from Israel's borders. It is truly miraculous. And whether the Queen of Sheba was from the African coast or the far edge of the Arabian Peninsula or even as far as India, what God was doing in Israel was being talked about throughout many, many nations. Israel was serving God, and things were going well. The Queen of Sheba left her gifts of spices, gold, and precious gems for Solomon. And then Solomon, in turn, gave her the gifts that he had prepared for her, as well as anything else that she had requested before she returned to her nation. Wow. So he prepared gifts, and then let her take whatever else she asked for. We're not given a specific list of what that included, but can we really think of things going any better for Solomon that he's able to just be like, whatever you want, take it? Can things be going any better? Can we be that generous? Could things be going that well? You just be like, if you ask for it, you can have it. Wow. And next, as we go down through, we read about all of the wealth that Solomon was accumulating. He had built the temple. He built the palace. He built a lot more. To pay off that cedar and other materials that he had used from King Hiram of Tyre, he gifted 20 cities in the region of Galilee to this king. Hiram wasn't that impressed, but, he gave away 20 cities to pay for the materials for everything he was building. So he was building a lot, okay? He built a fleet of ships with King Hiram of Tyre as well. And Tyre we put that in like modern day Lebanon-ish, okay? And over time, we hear of King Hiram bringing more gold to Solomon. So much gold poured in from the merchants, the traders, the kings, the governors. The amounts listed, I don't even know how to convert that to today's dollars, okay? But gold was pouring in, okay? And what Solomon did with it seems a bit absurd to me, but I've never had piles of gold to just do things with, okay? So I don't know what I would do with the amount of gold that was flowing in. We read that he had 200 large shields of gold and 300 small shields of gold that he just placed in the palace. That's 500 shields of gold, okay? He made this large throne of ivory, and it's this really big throne that has 6 stairs leading up to, and it has a curved back and armrests. And on each side of the throne and up the stairs, there are 6 lion statues on each side. So we got 12 statues of lions up to this giant ivory throne with armrests and rounded back. And it's made of ivory, and then he covers it in gold. I don't know why we're covering things that are already a precious material with more gold, but that's apparently how much gold we have. Okay? He had all of his household cups and other items made of gold, because why not? Okay? We're told that nothing was made of silver, because silver was not expensive enough. There was so much gold that silver was basically worthless at this time. That's how much gold we have. Okay? Silver not being valuable at all due to the extreme wealth that Solomon had. We read that about every 3 years, Solomon's fleet of ships and King Hiram's fleet of ships would come into port from distant lands with cargoes of stuff. This would be gold. It'd bring in silver too, but apparently we're not taking the silver to the palace. I don't know what they're doing with silver, but there'd be ivory, there would be apes and peacocks. They came from a distant land far enough away that it took 3 years for the ships to come from, so they're traveling quite a distance. And apes and peacocks don't serve much practical use for anybody. The average citizen did not need apes or peacocks, so these are definitely luxury items that were coming in for Solomon's collection. Okay. Yeah, I don't know what else we would do with them besides look at them. They don't serve practical purposes. So we can just see how well things are financially going for Solomon. And all of the wealth and the wisdom drew people from far-off nations to visit Solomon, just as it had the Queen of Sheba. And for years, visitors came to see Solomon's wisdom, and they brought him gifts. I always think that's interesting. He's the wealthiest man alive, and we keep bringing him gifts. Okay, I don't understand, but this is what was happening. And his wealth grew with the gifts, and Solomon then decides that he's going to buy 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses. If any of you have a horse, you know how much maintenance they are, and the upkeep and the care and all of those things. Multiply that by 12,000, plus, of course, the chariots and the upkeep they have. So Solomon spread all of chariots and horses out among all of the cities of Israel. And then he even began selling horses and chariots to other surrounding nations like the Hittites and the Syrians. And from the eyes of the world, Solomon is growing his kingdom well. But throughout the years, gold, luxury, horses are not the only thing that Solomon was acquiring. Solomon began to take on many foreign wives. And this was a common practice in other countries at that time. They did this as a version to form alliance and peace treaties with the nations around them. Here, it'd be like, here, take my daughter. So the king would be like, here, take my daughter, and we have a peace treaty, okay? So Solomon ended up with 700 royal wives. So these would have been ones brought to him as a form of peace treaty. So these are all the nations that he is making alliances, whether they're peace, trade. So every time they made a deal, he would get a wife out of it. And he also ended up with about 300 concubines. So these would have been normal women that he just found beautiful and collected. He married Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, Hittites, and more. Unfortunately, many of the wives came from nations that God had commanded the Israelites not to intermarry with due to those nations' allegiance to their false gods. I know when we just talked about the Queen of Sheba's visit and how Solomon gave her his prepared gifts and anything else she asked for. Okay? We just talked about that. Well, here's a side bit that I could be completely wrong about because it is a weird bit of speculation that I went down a rabbit hole researching. It's not found in Scripture, and it cannot concretely be proved by other history sources. But this legend has existed for a long time throughout history. There is a long line of rulers in Ethiopia, which is one of the possibilities of where the Queen of Sheba was from. This long line of rulers claims to be one of Solomon's descendants. The story was that they came from the marriage of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. If true, although, again, I can't tell you what the likelihood of this is, it would mean that one of the things that the Queen of Sheba requested from Solomon was a descendant from him that might carry on his wisdom in her nation. This would make it that the Queen of Sheba would have been one of Solomon's wives that would have left pregnant to return to her country. And it's just one of those historical legends that exists that isn't in the Bible. And some sources are like, no, that's totally impossible. And other sources were like, well, this came from somewhere. This legend started somewhere because how does Ethiopia have a line of kings that talk about Solomon? I don't know. But it's a weird request of things that Solomon may have given the Queen of Sheba before she left. But besides intermarrying with those who served other gods, many of Solomon's friends, if you read through all of his building projects, you see that Solomon became pretty close with Hiram, king of Tyre, because he worked with him for decades, building the temple, building the palace, building ships, trading, and those friends like King Hiram were among those who served gods of other nations. And eventually, we see Solomon allowed those who were closest to him, his friends and his wives, were able to shift his alliance from the king of Israel to the gods of other nations. We read that Solomon was not wholeheartedly devoted to the Lord his God, as his father David had been. Solomon worshipped the Sidonian goddess Astarte and the detestable Ammonite god Milcom. Solomon did evil in the Lord's sight. He did not remain loyal to the Lord as his father David had. Furthermore, on the hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for the detestable Moabite god Chemosh and for the detestable Ammonite god Milcom. He built high places for all of his foreign wives so they could burn incense and make sacrifices to their gods. And you know, God had built the temple as a permanent place of where his dwelling would be so that he would be the only God served, and took away the high places. But you know who was really good at building high places? King Hiram of Tyre. His friendship and his wives got him in trouble here. And this is quite a change from the young king who asks for God's wisdom to rule his people wisely and judiciously. And this wasn't an overnight shift, okay? This wasn't like, I built the temple today, I worship the other gods tomorrow. Like, this wasn't what was happening. Although we read this from one chapter to the next in these few pages, Solomon has lived a lifetime. Things were going so well. So well. And we started to see hints of things going wrong in the building of the size of God's temple versus Solomon's palace. And there are the luxuries pouring into the country that did not benefit the average citizen. There's that sheer and massing of incredible wealth. That insane throne with the lions, okay? The ships of merchants' wealth, the horses, the chariots, the absurd collection of wives. We can see all this listed, and we can see those flashing red lights, okay? We see it because we just listed them all off, and we're like, warning, there might be some problems here. But this happened over years and years and years. And somewhere along the line, Solomon must have stopped talking with God for the needed wisdom and began slowly, solely relying on himself and the blessings that God had poured out without being in actual relationship with God. God had poured out blessing upon Solomon. But let's see how God responded to Solomon now. In 1 Kings 11, 9 through 13, we read, "The Lord was angry with Solomon because he had shifted his allegiance away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him on 2 separate occasions. First when he asked for wisdom, second when he blessed the temple. And had warned him about this very thing so that he would not follow other gods, but he did not obey the Lord's command. So the Lord said to Solomon, because you insist on doing these things and have not kept the covenantal rules I gave you, I will surely tear the kingdom away from you and give it to your servant. However, for your father David's sake, I will not do this while you are alive. I will tear it away from your son's hand instead. But I will not tear away the entire kingdom. I will leave your son, one tribe, for my servant David's sake and for the sake of my chosen city, Jerusalem." God had spoken to Solomon when he asked for wisdom and when he dedicated the temple to him, promising him blessing on him, on Israel, while Solomon was faithful to him, and warning him of the consequences should he choose to serve other gods. This wasn't random. This would have been something that Solomon knew. This is something that Solomon's wisdom should have said, hey, that's not what we do. This is wrong. Solomon would have known this. He's a very wise man, as we've been told, okay? But think about your walk with God for a moment. Maybe you're just starting out your walk with God, and everything is new, and it's exciting. Maybe you're hungry to know more about God, and you eagerly want to hear what he says to you. And I'm not pretending this stage is easy, as the life that God is leading to you may be very different from the life you were living, and adjusting to following after God might be challenging, but it is an exciting beginning stage of a relationship where you're wanting to constantly talk to God. Maybe you're in a stable phase of constant relationship with God where God is speaking to you and you are mostly able to faithfully follow after what he's saying. I'm not saying that we don't mess up or have room for growth. You know, God forgave David as his walk faltered and fell, and he sinned miserably, but he forgave David when he repented. And we have that same grace in Jesus as we walk following his example. Sometimes well, sometimes not so well, but allowing us to come back in right relationship with him. However, it is also possible that you've hit a phase like Solomon did at the end of his life, where he had once walked with God, but somewhere along the line, that walk mostly became about the self. Everything was going well for a season. He had what he needed. He had the wisdom poured out. He was full of knowledge. He was full of skill. He had the materials. He had the supplies. His strength was all he needed. Maybe your strength seems like all you need right now. Solomon's needs were met and exceeded. Things were going so well. He thought he was successful on his own. And maybe you're sitting here today and you're like, I can't relate to Solomon. It's not like I'm wealthy to the point of covering everything in gold. Okay? Well, maybe not. I certainly am not wealthy enough to cover everything in gold. But as people who live in America, I would say pretty much all of us are in the top couple percent of the wealthiest people in the world. Even if you're considered lower class financially here in America, you would still be in the top couple percent of wealthiest people in the world. We have homes that we live in, stable housing. You know where your next food is coming from. You live on more than a couple dollars a day. You have access to a vehicle. You have electricity. You have clean water. You're able to get health care of some sort. There's a number of luxuries that make us very wealthy and compared to the majority of the world. Even those that struggle and we serve because they have less comparable wealth to their surrounding Americans would still be considered more wealthy than some of the world's poor. And that's a sobering thought. We are mostly able to provide for our own needs. We're able to get through our work. We're able to do what we have to do in life without much reliance on God due to our relative wealth. We watch our friends who don't believe in God do this every day. They make good lives living here in America. Like I said, even those who are struggling here in America for their next meal or struggling with permanent shelter or other needs that come about, they still have more access to resources than some parts of the world. And here at Faith, we will continue to serve those who struggle regardless, because that's part of what we believe in as a church. Because we're going to be a blessing regardless, as that's what God has called us to do. However, this is an illustration to show how much we have and how amassing stuff and skill can lead us to relying on ourselves and not on the God that has blessed us so. Solomon shows us the end of that road. too long on self-reliance, too long of making the decisions that followed the example of how other nations or other people were doing it, too long of hearing the praises of others, and Solomon believed the lie that he knew best, that he could do as he thought was right and not what God said. The lies spoken to him from others, he eventually believed. And what were the consequences of Solomon's falling out of relationship with God? It's not like God just showed up instantly and stripped away all the wealth that Solomon had amassed. Actually, we don't see that. He didn't take away the things that Solomon had stumbled over. But problems arose that Solomon could no longer resolve on his own strength. Enemies that Solomon once had peace with started causing problems. Some of those people that worked for Solomon rose up against him. After Solomon's death, this would eventually lead to the kingdom of Israel splitting in two less powerful Israelite kingdoms, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And they fought each other and their neighbors for supremacy in the region for years and years and years. And we're going to hear more about the events of the kingdom split and the decisions of the rulers who followed Solomon. But for today, how is your relationship with God? Are you actually listening to God and responding to what he is saying? Are people drawn to you for what God is doing in your life? Or have you just been bobbing along on your own strength, looking like you're following God, but actually not in relationship with him? You know, it took a long time, but eventually those cracks begin to show, and it becomes apparent that the God of our life might be ourselves instead. Are people praising your skills or things you have and not seeing the God that you serve? And you know, there's a verse I learned as a kid that sticks with me whenever I get too proud and take credit for all of my own accomplishments. And ironically, it is Solomon who wrote it in his early years when he was in right relationship with God. Proverbs 3:5-6 says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not rely on your own understanding. Acknowledge him in all your ways and he will make your path straight." It's weird to think that the man who wrote that at one point in his life and walked so closely with God just would have this slow fade over the decades where he lost his relationship with God. And regardless of how we walked in today, though, it isn't actually too late to be in relationship with God and not completely lean on our own strength and understanding. We're here today. And the wonderful thing about Jesus is he always lets us come back. And just as God had chosen Israel to be his chosen people to represent God to the nations, in 1 Peter 2:9, we read that you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people of his own, so you may proclaim the virtues of the one who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. You know, God has greatly blessed each one of us today. And it is our choice if we're going to be that chosen people, that holy nation that chooses to constantly listen, serve, and follow after him today. Let's pray today. God, I thank you for your wisdom. I thank you that you include stories like this in the Bible that show us both the things that go well when people do it right, Lord. You show us those examples, but you also show us when people make mistakes, when people choose not to follow you. We see examples of people loving you and people falling away, Lord, and we're able to make those decisions ourselves. Lord, I just ask for your grace. I ask for your mercy. And I ask that for those who feel far away from you today, that you will speak to them, that whatever you have for their life at the moment, that you will make your presence known in their life, that no one is too far to come back to you and to follow after you. Lord, I ask that you do not let our relative wealth, that you do not let our busyness, that you do not let our skills, our accomplishments, the things that are going well in our life distract us from following after you. Lord, I just ask that you would remind us that all of the things that are good in our life have come from you, and that you are the God we serve. Lord, just pour out your blessing and your presence on us today. In your name I pray. Amen. Well, I hope you were challenged and encouraged today. And thank you all for coming. And I hope to see you next week here or on Tuesday at Dinner Church. Thank you.